February 1978, in Great Britain, began as a typical grey and slightly damp end to winter. The country was in a state of cultural and political transition. On the radio stations, punk rock was giving way to disco, and the streets were dominated by iconic British cars of that era, such as the Ford Cortina and Austin Allegro. Nothing in the weather forecast predicted that in a few days, the southwest of England, Wales, and parts of Scotland would turn into a lifeless, icy wilderness. The meteorological trap snapped shut suddenly. The cause was a catastrophic collision of two giant air masses. An abnormally cold front carrying dry, freezing air was moving from the north, from the direction of the Arctic and Siberia. At the same time, a powerful cyclone saturated with moisture was racing in from the Atlantic. The point of their impact was the southern and western counties of Britain. On Saturday, February 18th, the sky over Devon and Cornwall suddenly darkened, taking on a strange leaden purple hue. The wind, which had previously been merely gusty, abruptly escalated to hurricane force, reaching speeds of 90 miles per hour. The temperature plummeted before people's eyes. When the snowfall began, it wasn't the usual flakes. It was a dense, stinging snow dust that moved horizontally due to the wind. In a matter of minutes, visibility dropped to zero. A phase began that scientists call a whiteout. In this state, a person loses orientation. The sky merges with the ground. There are no shadows and no horizon. People who were outside at that moment described it as trying to walk inside a giant cloud of milk. Snow fell with incredible intensity, up to 5 centimetres per hour. To understand the scale, in one night, some areas received as much snow as they usually do in 2 or 3 years. Britain, whose infrastructure traditionally falters even before a thin layer of frost, found itself completely defenseless. Warning systems in 1978 operated through radio and rare news broadcasts, so thousands of people only learned of the trouble when their front doors were completely blocked by drifts, and their ground floor windows disappeared behind a white wall. This was the beginning of a 48-hour nightmare that would forever change the British perception of what their mild winter was capable of. By the evening of February 18th, the main transport arteries of southwest England had turned into giant graveyards of machinery. The A30 and A38 highways connecting Devon and Cornwall with the rest of the country became the epicenter of chaos. Drivers who had set off during light snow suddenly found themselves inside a blinding white vortex. Visibility was reduced to an arm's length. Cars began to skid, collide, and slide into ditches. Due to the hurricane-force winds, snowdrifts grew so rapidly that if a vehicle stopped for just a few minutes, the snow would already reach window level. Soon, traffic came to a complete standstill, stretching for miles with lines of buried cars, trucks, and intercity buses. For thousands of people, a long night of struggle for survival began. Inside the cars, it became unbearably cold. Drivers were forced to choose: leave the engine running to stay warm, risking carbon monoxide poisoning from a snow-blocked exhaust pipe, or turn off the ignition and freeze in the dark. Radio broadcasts of the time were filled with desperate pleas not to leave vehicles, as in whiteout conditions. A person could lose their way and freeze to death just 10 meters from their car. Nevertheless, some tried to make it to nearby houses, sinking chest deep into the snow. Abandoned cars were left right in the middle of the road, which later made it impossible for snowplows to pass. On the morning of February 19th, the world woke up to a surreal sight. Massive double-decker Bristol and Leyland buses stood buried under the snow so deeply that only their roofs were visible. Hundreds of people spent more than 20 hours in this trap. In some cases, bus passengers were rescued through roof hatches because the doors were firmly blocked by an icy crust. Volunteers from nearby villages, risking their lives, made their way to the stranded columns on skis or tractors, delivering hot tea and blankets. It was the largest road disaster in the region's history. More than 2,000 vehicles were abandoned, and it took weeks just to clear the roads of this steel chaos. While road crews unsuccessfully tried to break through the steel blockades on the highways, the rest of the country faced another, equally terrifying reality: total isolation. The blizzard of 1978 didn't just bury roads, it destroyed vital infrastructure. Hurricane-force winds and heavy, icy snow tore power lines like thin threads. Within hours, hundreds of thousands of homes in Devon, Somerset, and South Wales were plunged into total darkness. The blackout meant not only no light, but also the failure of water pumps and the shutdown of heating systems. In houses without fireplaces, temperatures plummeted to sub-zero levels. British residents, accustomed to the comforts of the 70s, suddenly found themselves in medieval conditions, where the only sources of heat were candles and gas burners, the supplies of which were dwindling. The situation in the countryside took on the proportions of a national tragedy. Farmlands, the backbone of the Southwest's economy, turned into a silent white void. Snowdrifts were so high that they completely concealed fences and gates, leaving thousands of sheep and cattle buried alive under meters of snow. Farmers, risking their lives, went out to search for their herds in the whiteout, navigating only by memory, but often found only icy mounds hiding suffocated animals. Those that survived suffered from hunger, as fodder was locked in warehouses that were impossible to reach. Agricultural losses ran into millions of pounds, and the sight of thousands of dead animals became one of the darkest memories of that winter. Communication with the outside world was virtually severed. Telephone lines snapped under the weight of ice, and radio stations could only broadcast general warnings that did little to help those whose houses were buried to the roofline. Villages turned into isolated islands. People were forced to dig tunnels in the snow just to leave their houses for firewood or to check on neighbors. It was during these days that the true community spirit emerged. Those with remaining food supplies and working stoves took in dozens of people. The Britain of 1978 ceased for a few days to be a modern country and turned into an archipelago of snow-lost settlements, each fighting its own battle for survival while waiting for help from the sky. When it became clear that ground services were powerless against the 6-meter drifts, the British government launched one of the largest peacetime rescue missions, codenamed Operation Snowdrop. The only hope for thousands cut off from the world was aviation. The skies over the snow-covered counties filled with the roar of heavy Sea King and Wessex helicopters from the RAF and the Royal Navy. Pilots performed true feats of heroism, maneuvering in low visibility and treacherous air currents. Helicopters became the only link to civilization. They delivered medicine to hospitals running low on supplies and transported doctors to expectant mothers and the critically ill directly onto snow-covered fields. The most dramatic footage of the time captured the rescue of people from the roofs of stranded buses and the cabs of trucks, which by then had turned into icy crypts. Helicopter crews hovered just meters above the drifts, hoisting exhausted people who had spent more than 24 hours in the snow trap. Parallel to the human rescue, Operation Snowdrop tackled the critical task of saving surviving livestock. Pilots dropped bales of hay onto farms that had turned into isolated islands. These images, bales of fodder falling from the sky against an endless white desert, became a symbol of hope for devastated farmers. On the ground, heroic work also continued relentlessly. The army deployed heavy armored vehicles. Tanks and APCs were used as improvised tractors to punch corridors through the snow where ordinary bulldozers failed. Soldiers and volunteers worked 20 hours a day, literally digging out the entrances to nursing homes by hand and delivering food to the elderly. It was a time when social barriers vanished. Owners of powerful tractors helped their neighbors, and local radio stations operated in a liveline mode, coordinating aid. Operation Snowdrop demonstrated that even under the harshest climatic blow, organization and human courage can prevent even greater casualties, turning chaos into a finely tuned rescue system. By late February 1978, nature began to gradually loosen its grip. But the departure of the elements brought new trials. When the temperature finally rose above freezing, millions of tons of snow began to melt rapidly, turning roads into raging rivers and lowlands into lakes of icy mud. The floods that followed the blizzard caused no less damage to infrastructure, washing away building foundations and railway embankments. The country began to calculate the losses. The economic damage amounted to hundreds of millions of pounds. Southwest agriculture was undermined. The loss of over 100,000 livestock was a devastating blow to farmers, one that many could not recover from for years. However, the main consequence of the 1978 whiteout was a complete overhaul of the UK's civil defence system. The disaster exposed the critical vulnerability of power grids and the shortage of specialised machinery. Following that winter, the government invested heavily in modernising power lines and creating regional stockpiles of food and equipment for emergency situations. New protocols for cooperation between the police, the army, and meteorological services were developed. Meteorologists themselves received a powerful incentive to develop early warning systems. It became obvious that in the modern world, a forecast error of just a few hours could cost hundreds of lives. Today, the events of 1978 remain in the memory of Britons as a symbol of an incredible ordeal and unity. Archives hold thousands of photographs of abandoned cars and helicopters in the sky, which still evoke awe in new generations. For those who survived this blizzard, it became a reference point, that winter, against which any subsequent cold spells are compared. The tragedy taught the nation to respect the unpredictability of the climate and proved that even the most advanced technology of the 70s is powerless against the primal force of an Arctic storm. The whiteout left behind not only destruction, but also valuable experience that helps Britain remain prepared for whatever challenges the sky may bring.